Hello and welcome to WCET's webcast, Combating Fraud While Protecting Aid for True Students. My name is Megan Raymond. I manage our programs and events here at WCET. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. First, I'd like to thank Blackboard Collaborate for making the platform available. If you have any technical issues, please contact Blackboard directly, and I'll go ahead and put that into the chat box. Today, the presenters are going to communicate with you via audio. We're not going to use the video portion today, so if you'd like, you can actually pull the chat box up. You can expand that, and you can even pull it into the middle of the whiteboard if you'd like. But if you would like to minimize the video portion on the upper left hand, that'll help so you can keep track of the conversations. I'll post a link to the PowerPoint slides shortly. This is being recorded and we'll make all the resources available on the WCET website next week. As we go along, please go ahead and add your questions to the chat box. If you have any comments, questions, resources to share, go ahead and enter them there. The moderators will be keeping track of what's going on. I'll be pulling out questions and sharing them with our moderator today. And then at the end of each portion, we have 3 separate segments today. So at the end of each segment, we'll be addressing questions, and then hopefully we have plenty of time for your questions at the end. Our moderator today is Luke Dowden, and he's the director of the Office of Distance Learning at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette and a longtime WCET friend. I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Luke.
Thanks, Megan. Can you tell me if you can hear me okay? I just want to make sure that before we continue, you can hear me. We've got a great lineup today. As Megan said, I'm Luke Dowden. I'm a member of the WCET Steering Committee, and I've been a part of the Common Interest Group for Student Authentication and Academic Integrity for about 3 years. And so we're a collection of members that are constantly asking the question, what should we be talking about? And certainly today's session is something we feel very strongly should be shared with our members. So without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters for today. Joseph Agins is the Director of Ethics and Compliance at the Apollo Group, and I think you'll find he's well-versed in some of the things that are happening at the federal level and has got some real campus experience to share. Keisha Brock is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Advancement at Rio Salado College. She's going to give you a different institutional approach to the issue that we'll be discussing today, and then turn it over to her colleague Ruby Miller, who's really on the ground dealing with the issue of fraud, and she's the Associate Dean of Enrollment Services. So we're really happy to have these presenters share with us information. Please use the chat area, if you will, to input your questions. Megan and I will be monitoring those questions and making a list of those to address at the appropriate time. So without further ado, we'll welcome Joe Agins. Joe?
Thank you very much, Luke. As he said, my name is Joseph Agins. I'm the Director of Ethics and Compliance Investigations for Apollo Education Group. As many of you know, Apollo Education Group is the parent company or the holding company for a number of higher educational institutions of higher learning. Mainly, one of the best-known ones is, of course, University of Phoenix, but there are a multitude of others, domestic and abroad. I do work for Apollo, for a department which we refer to as Apollo Ethics and Compliance, and I'm in charge of internal investigations, a number of other things, and the student fraud investigation. So.
Joe, this is Megan. I'm sorry to jump and interrupt. There's been a couple comments that people can't hear you as well, so if you could speak up a little louder. And for those in the audience, if you could adjust your volume by clicking on the little slider above the video button. Sorry about that interruption. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, sorry about that. If I need to speak up more, please let me know. I will test before this, and it seemed to be working fine, but I'll try and speak up. So anyways, primarily, as I said, the main school out there is University of Phoenix. That's the one where we're seeing the bulk of the issues when it comes to student fraud and these fraud rings. Since I'm really a fraud guy by trade, my background is in fraud and specifically in banking and credit card. I've been with the University of Phoenix about 10 years. And since then, you know, this is one of the issues that I've taken on in my role. So I'm not as much of an educator and an education specialist as many of my colleagues that are presenting with me today, and as many of you out there. I've been in the space for quite some time, and I do have a large background in fraud. So with that said, I'm really excited to be able to be part of this presentation today and to be invited and to communicate with you all. As I, you know, patient space and being a fraud guy, this is something that I can talk about all day long. It's what I do pretty much most of the time. So I'm very honored to be part of this. And one of the main things, and I think the reason that we're presentation like this, and the reason that I'm always happy to participate, is the more that we can get this information out there to folks, the better it is for us, and the worse it is for fraudsters and those would wish to do our organizations and this financial aid program harm. So anything I can ever do to socialize and get information out there, I'm always happy to do. So that said, you know, this session is on preventing student financial aid fraud. Specifically, I think what I'm going to talk about is the organized financial aid fraud schemes that are primarily conducted through the distance education model. So pretty much any school out there that does distance education and has the right setup, if you will, for these students to attack, or I shouldn't even call them students, but these fraudsters to attack. If they haven't already started doing it, you know, it's not a matter of when. So if your school, you know, is involved in distance education and set up for them to do this, it's probably already happening, and if it's not, it's going to happen. Or if this is something that schools are pursuing in the future, it's very important to be adept and understand what's going on out there. We obviously have a large footprint in our school, and so we've started seeing these things since 2008, and we've developed a program which we're going to talk about going forward to do this. So I wanted to play a video, and I'll just ask Megan, do I click on the link here, or is there another way that we can play that quick video?
I'll go ahead and take care of it.
And this video, by the way, does a very good job of explaining the fraud schemes and kind of what we're looking at. This was a situation in California in a recent one.
Your child Scholarshare 529 college savings account today and prepare to share a brighter tomorrow. Visit scholarshare.com. It's how Californians save for college. With college tuition costs.
Better value.
It looks like maybe the video is not going to work.
Sorry about that. For some reason, I don't know what's wrong, but I'll go ahead and enter it into the window, and then people can access it on their own. So there's the video, but if you want to go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. And please do access that. I think the video does a good job for those that aren't fully aware of these schemes and what they're about. You know, being a news clip, it does do a real concise and quick job of explaining these particular fraud schemes and how they operate and how big the problem is, and fortunately how a lot of these people are. You know, there's more and more arrests being made, and more of these fraudsters are being busted. The more that these fraud schemes are brought into the limelight, you know, the better it is. And this video talks about it. So I'll go through a couple of these other slides here just as an introduction. This next one talks about a fraud scheme in Metro Detroit, which was a large one, and this was actually the first one we had. This is how we did schemes when they were attacking University of Phoenix. It was back in 2008, and as you can see by this date here, it was 2013 before the actual person or group was ever even brought to justice. So that's one thing we'll talk about going forward, is that these schemes do take a while, even once they're identified, for the OIG to investigate them and for them to be successfully prosecuted. There can be a multitude of years that go by before that ever happens. I just clicked through, for the sake of time, a couple of other articles there, but there are many out there, and they're very interesting. You can learn a lot just by looking at the articles and the different schemes that have been successfully caught, investigated, and prosecuted. So just the final part of my introduction was just to talk about the regulatory references kind of in summary, and basically the obligations that everybody on this call probably are, that we as institutions have in turning this, identifying these fraudsters and referring them to the department and to the OIG. We need to do this because it's the right thing to do for our institution and for us as taxpayers, but also it's our obligation. And these particular regulations, with regard to administrative capability and resolving conflicting data are specific to that, and there are just a couple of many that specifically outline our obligation to do that. Another one is, of course, the red flags rule, which many of us are bound by, which has to do with identity theft. And as we'll talk about later on in this presentation, many of these schemes, there's ringleaders that are involved, and then there's willing participants that they recruit. They also steal identities, and so there's a lot of identity theft when it has to do with these particular schemes. So the red flag rules certainly come into play as well. There's also an audit report from the Office of Inspector General that came out a while back, where they had identified a number of holes or gaps, if you will, in the process, necessarily just for schools, but also for the department in general, the Department of Education. And so they submitted a bunch of, they did an audit and submitted a bunch of things that they would like to see done. And really, you can look at this yourself, but the main thing is that one of the important things that I think we should stress is that the OIG and the Department of Education can only do so much, and they are taking steps towards making this better. But the problem is here; it's been here for a while, and it's really up to the institutions to take responsibility. And the OIG has said they can only do so much, and so they're really looking at the institutions' ways to combat this. And so this is again the reason why it's so important for folks like us to communicate, to share best practices, to understand what's, and not try and reinvent the wheel every time, to figure out ways to put these fraudsters out of business, because the OIG and the Department of Ed is putting it back on us. They're going to do things and they're going to implement things, but as we all know, that's easier said than done, and sometimes this can take a while. And so in the meantime, we need to work hard on our own to develop systems so that we can satisfy our obligation and responsibility when it comes to this. So my time is about up here. The fraud ring characteristics, basically these schemes typically target online and less expensive 2-year entry-level programs. There's typically a ringleader or ringleaders involved that recruit, enticing them with opportunities of free money. They don't really talk about the loan part. They talk more about the grant part. Scheme participants typically target vulnerable populations, younger persons, people who don't understand credit, people who are in economically depressed areas, people who have never seen this sort of money, and people, most of them involved don't really have a high school diploma or GED. Ringleader sets up accounts with few common addresses or emails. This we'll get into when we talk about data and how that we can identify these potential schemes. Usually the ringleader, the participants provide their information to the ringleader, and then their information, the ringleader does everything else, and then there's some sort of a split once the funds are dispersed. And once they are dispersed, the student stops attending and we never hear from them again. Some ringleaders even attend school themselves, persist on satisfactorily, getting satisfactory academic progress, and typically that's how they've learned this. And then ringleaders, as I talked about earlier, will also steal identities to avoid having to split the proceeds. So obviously if they can steal identities, they can keep the whole pot instead of having to share that with the participants or the recruits. So those are fraud ring characteristics. I'll stop now for questions. I'm a little bit over as far as my time. If anybody has questions for me, I'm happy to answer them now, or we can just move on to the next section.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Folks, just a reminder in the chat area, if you'll place your questions there. When we transition to our next presenter, we're going to ask Joe to do an audio check, and so we are reading and seeing your responses. And And the slides will be available. I think Megan has already provided the link to those, and we'll be providing those as well. So any other questions, please put there, but we're going to go ahead and transition to our next presenter to keep us on time. Keisha?
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. Good. I hope I'm not sounding muffled. Before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of information about Rio Salado College and why I think the information is pertinent, because it certainly lends itself to the activity we've been experiencing over the course of the last 4 to 6 years related to financial aid fraud. So we are a public community college, one of the 10 Maricopa community colleges. We primarily focus in online learning, and we're open access, so we don't historically have not put a lot of enrollment or admission barriers in place, or not barriers, but procedures in place for students. We are very affordable in-state, which means that there would be a big return in terms of a financial aid refund. And we experienced incredibly rapid enrollment growth from about 2007 through around 2011, 2012. And then I wanted to also let you know we're a PeopleSoft school, because as Ruby Miller goes into some of the specific things we've implemented, I think it'll be many of you will be asking yourselves, how did we do it, what system are we on, etc. So moving to the next piece, our initial experience was a very public experience. Our initial experience with financial aid fraud, we discovered a fraud ring in late 2007, early 2008, and reported it to the Office of Inspector General. And then we collaboratively worked with them to actually successfully prosecute and convict the individuals in the ring. And it was basically, it was a ringleader, local in Phoenix, who had recruited several people, 4 people I believe, to go out and recruit people, straw students, to participate in this financial aid distance education program to get pieces of basically they would get aid for the students and then give a portion of that money to the straw students, and then they would keep the remainder for them. We did convict successfully all of those students, but it certainly was a huge entrance into the world of how to combat financial aid fraud. So moving from that point forward, we still really, I think, had no idea, and I don't think we did nationally either, of the pervasiveness and the extent of this whole concept of fraud rings. In 2007 or 2008, when we discovered the Trenda Holton case, through about 2011, we continued to look and figure out ways that we could identify suspicious activity. But I think, as everyone else in the nation, we were learning about what to look for. And we would just, as we identified odd things, work with the OIG to report that information to them. In around 2011, though, we realized that this issue was much larger than we had anticipated, and we really began to look at how we could use data and other processes to combat this a little more effectively. We did a soft launch of what we're going to talk about today in 2011, the end of 2011, December of 2011, and then we did a hard launch in 2012 and a more automated, thorough, or more broad launch of the authentication process that Ruby's going to go into detail about in July of 2013. And we are currently working with the other 9 community colleges in the system to implement this strategy district-wide. So we do think it's been effective, although it is not 100%. I would say we've reduced our suspected incidents of fraud by about 85–90%, but there are still people who can get through the system. So one of the things we've learned over the course of the last 4 to 6 years really is the enormity of the institutional impact of financial aid fraud. And this is one of the things that really prompted us to act outside of the regulatory responsibility that we all have. It also takes a burden or a toll on your institution and directs you away from the core business of providing opportunities to higher education. So huge financial implications relative to student debt and collecting student debt, institutional debt, also huge rising cohort default rates. You know, these students who are these straw students or the people who are victims of identity theft are not going to be repaying their loans or going into repayment. It creates challenges with projecting footsie and headcount accurately. You could have public or reputational damage. And the thing that was really pressing for me is what it does to your staff morale, your staff time and resources, etc. And then, of course, the ongoing responsibility to report to the OIG, to testify, and to investigate identity theft claims. So all of these things really drove us to come up with a more comprehensive, oh, and sorry, I didn't change the slide. That's what I was speaking with. Sorry about that. A more comprehensive approach. So we then moved on to how can we address this as an institution? And first and foremost, we needed to clearly define some staff expectations. We needed to articulate what constituted suspicious behavior, but make sure that we applied a fair and equitable standard. We didn't want to assume, for example, that all students calling from a particular zip code were definitely a member of a fraud ring. We also really needed to work closely with our legal office to ensure that we were remaining true to our statute to remain open access. We were established as an open access institution, and so we wanted to remain true to that. We also wanted to learn from other institutions, and we began working with Joe and team at the University of Phoenix early on, probably around 2010, 2011, right around this time, to see what they were doing, because they were really doing some pretty good things at that point in time. We also contacted Lansing Community College and a number of other institutions. And I think this was our real amazing aha and you know, this might seem very logical to you all, but it's not a financial aid issue. It's an institutional issue. And as soon as you can take the solution out of financial aid, I think that will allow you the opportunity to implement something much more successful. So it was a balancing act. We wanted to make sure that we did not harm students, that we remain true to the mission of access, affordability, and student success. However, we wanted to implement effective deterrence against suspected fraud, which was, I'm sorry, I keep delaying on the moving forward of my slides. So, you know, we're trying to figure out how to balance those two things. Also, as a public institution, we needed to ensure that we were being aware of the efficient use of public resources. So we needed to make sure that we were effective in what systems we put into place. So we collaborated with institutional research, the conduct area, admissions, and we designed a process that we could embed as part of the new student flow. And it had really a few elements. The two most effective elements, I think, were the authentication process that Ruby is going to speak to, the use of data, although we are not as well versed in that as the University of Phoenix, and then really aligning it with our student success interventions. So those were really key. So when I talk about redesigning the flow, as an open access institution, students come in with many different goals. We needed to first and foremost identify any student who was seeking a program, and then rather than again putting this in the financial aid purview, we wanted to put it in the initial or the admissions purview. And so we designed and implemented at the point of inquiry, initial inquiry or intake into our system, this identity and prior education process. We also implemented a number of student success strategies at that point too for all program seekers, and those things also slowed the fraud rings down. Let's see here. So one more thing to get into before Ruby goes on with her part is the importance of collaborating with our legal department. We needed to make sure that students could still admit and enroll even though we had this process on the front end. So essentially students could come in, admit, and take courses if they were self-pay without going through this authentication process that we're talking about relative to prior education. However, we would not begin processing their financial aid until we verify prior education and their identity. So I'm going to go ahead then and move on to Ruby now, and she can go into a little more detail about the authentication process that we established.
Okay, this is Ruby Miller. Can you all hear me?
There seemed to be a little bit of echo. Can you try again?
I'm going to talk a little bit about the processes we put in place in order to... Can I do what? Am I breaking up still?
There's a little bit of lag. It looks like it might have caught up.
Better?
Go ahead, try again.
Okay.
That's
this is Ruby Miller, and I am the Associate Dean of Student Affairs and Judicial Affairs here at Rio. And I became involved in this process because I do oversee the A&R office and I do student conduct. So I helped to create some processes that would assist us in helping the students get into the system and to our colleges without harming the students who are truly students. We had two processes we put in place, and that was we created authentication processes for two parts of a student's admissions to the college. First one being ID identification, and then prior education. And as Keisha had noted before, we started this process early on in fall of 11. And at that time, we were asking for IDs, and then later on, we asked for the prior education so that we could authenticate that they had graduated from high school or had a GED or the homeschooled certificate that they required in order to get financial aid. So the first process was the IDs, and we had to find out a way to get the IDs to us. Since we're an online college and wanted to authenticate all of our students, what was the best way to do this? So we decided that we should have a scanned color copy of a student's ID, because having them fax things in, we couldn't read it, couldn't tell what it said, and certainly couldn't see a picture. So that was put into place in 2011. And then the document is reviewed and verified and for authenticity. And to do the to-do items, we have two to-do items that go on a student's record. And because we are PeopleSoft, it goes into their student center. And in the student center, it says they have two items that they need to authenticate: their prior ed, and they need to authenticate their ID. And as they do that, those items come off. And typically what we've done is we get the ID first, and we hold that until we get the prior ed, and then we take both items off, so that the student then is cleared for processing of aid or anything that needs to happen. So anyhow, the to-do items are put on and then they're removed as we receive the documents. And I am the person who works with my staff to review unacceptable documentation. If we see something that's been sent to us that looks like it is not a document that's acceptable, it looks fraudulent, or there's something wrong, then that is brought to me, and then we decide whether or not we take disciplinary action. And based on the student code of conduct, submitting false documents or fake documents is a violation. So we review the student code of conduct, and administrative holds may be put on the student's account so that they can't move further into the process. One of the things that was really important too was communication with the student and the staff, so that everybody kind of knows what's going on with the documentation. We have an auto email identifying student documents have been received, and in that auto email it also tells the student that if documents aren't correct, then they need to resubmit, and at the bottom of the email it talks about the student code of conduct and submitting false documents. And we have, if people are familiar with PeopleSoft, in the comments sections we have put comments in so that we communicate with each other throughout our office, because we have about 40 staff members, and when students call we need to make sure that everybody is aware of where the student is in the process. So there's notes in there that indicate that we received their ID and or their prior ed. So the other thing that we guarantee the student that from 3 to 5 business days to process and remove both documents after both documents are received. So the students get anxious, and we've really been pretty good about being able to stay on that timeline as long as they're processing and doing what they're supposed to be doing. So the second one is the prior ed. And again, we do the to-do items, and they have to send us an official transcript from their high school, GED, and what we've done is we have set up a process that we have a list of all the agencies they need to contact within their state to get a GED if they have to do that, or a high school diploma if their high school is closed. Again, the communication process is very important, and the timeline is 3 to 5 business days. Resource implications, staffing levels. We started with 6 staff members, and the associate dean, we now have 4 staff members, and the student conduct issues are referred to the associate dean, so I'm not as involved in the process, the daily process. Skills and qualifications for persons that are very important. Our knowledge of A&R, financial aid, and student financial processes. They have to have access to SIS, of course. Attention to detail and good communication skills, because when the students get belligerent, they need to be able to communicate with them without having issues. Physical resources, SIS. We have an ID check-in guide, which is has driver's license and IDs in that booklet, and it identifies all the 50 states. A repository for the documents, color printer. We have service email accounts that the student can send their emails to. The HEP guide to verify accreditation. We have the list of agencies that students can contact for GED and other documents, and of course the homeschool process for obtaining diplomas. Lessons learned. Our process changes over time. It's changed from the beginning, and we're still looking at ways to make it better. Ringleaders figure out ways to attempt to get students registered. We have some that were in a certain area, and then they're coming back to us, trying to get in again. But we think communication between institutions is very important, and students stopped at our institution attempt to go to another Maricopa Community College, so we are working district-wide to put a process in place. Institutions need to develop a communication plan to assist other colleges when fraud is suspected. In other words, how do we talk to another institution without violating students' privacy or FERPA? So we need to really, as institutions, try to communicate this to each other. I had a lot of students coming to me asking for withdrawal letters in the beginning, and finally realized what they were trying to do, and at that point I stopped supplying withdrawal letters to students that were fraudulent students. And we have to outthink like the fraudsters. We have to be a step ahead. And that's what I have to offer.
From Rio, and then we'll move on, is that we, in terms of next steps, we continue to deal with this, even though we implemented some pretty effective deterrence in 2011, 2012. I just was meeting this morning with some Maricopa representatives. We're looking at ways to effectively, as a district, report to the OIG, sort of a centralized way to do that. University of Phoenix, Joe's going to go on now, and they've done some really tremendous things. Clearly a big difference in resource. So we're going to try and figure out how to implement some of the things that they're doing on a little bit maybe of a smaller scale. And then now that we're looking at how to address the cohort default rate implications relative to this, it should be a whole nother project. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now, I think, back to Luke.
Thanks a lot. We had quite a few questions come through, and so let's take a few moments if we can, Megan, and we'll answer some of those that have been asked. So we'll start with the first one. Came from Leslie. It said, how are cost of attendance calculated differently for distant students? And I don't know if there's someone that has more or less experience with that, Joe or Keisha or Ruby, if one of you want to take that question.
I can take an initial stab. We, as one of the 10 Maricopa community colleges, use the same cost of attendance formula as the other 9, with the exception of the transportation element or piece of that. So ours is a little less than the other 9 colleges, but generally we use the same calculation as the other 9 community colleges.
Okay. Joe, anything to add? Okay, we've got another question. It says, in regards to OIG involvement, was the aid returned under R2T4 leaving the balance with the college, or did the aid remain dispersed at the college? And I don't know who wants to take a stab at that question.
I can tell you from our experience, we have done the R2T4, we do the return, and the institution has all of the liability, and then the student has the debt, of course, wherever, per the policy, I guess. So the OIG has not, at this point in time there, and Joe, I want you to chime in on this, there's not really any forgiveness once the money goes out for any entity involved in it. I believe that even in the instance of the case that we worked collaboratively with them to prosecute, there was still institutional and student or straw student liability.
Okay, thanks, Keisha. Joe, did you want to comment?
No, I think this is one of those issues that's it's somewhat harder to describe, and I think there's more that goes into that than somebody like I can probably talk to intelligently. I think it depends on a number of different factors. So I think for instance, if the university goes into this and distributes the funds in good faith, where not necessarily all the funds need to be returned. So I think there's a number of, well, typically they are, but there's a number of different determining factors. To Keisha's point, I don't think there's forgiveness and things like that. I remember seeing this question in the chat box earlier, and I think they were trying to determine on, one of the reasons for asking this, and I could be wrong, was whether or not to engage the OIG depending on if the funds are returned. And in my opinion, in my understanding, either way, if there's any suspected fraud, even if we caught the fraudster before they got any funds and no funds were ever distributed at all, we're still going to refer them. So either way, regarding that specific question, any of these suspected fraudsters should be referred to the OIG so that they can have an awareness of that.
All right, just a few more questions. Keisha, this is for you or Ruby. It says, are there course design strategies Rio developed as additional strategies to weed out non-legitimate students? For example, authentic assignments, etc.
We do in our, I wouldn't say they're necessarily instructional design features as much as automation that we've implemented into our learning management system, but we do have a way to track participation, initial participation, and to verify that in the beginning. We also, the nature of our assignments, over half of our classes require in-person proctored midterms and finals, etc. So we do some things relative to authentication with respect to that, but we have not contracted with a company that pops into the LMS and asks a series of personally identifiable questions to verify identity, or there's some companies that use keyboard stroke recognition. We have not done any of that at this point in time.
And there's a question for Ruby. It says, given that Rio has weekly start dates for classes and you now have 4 staffers, any thoughts for schools that have traditional semester start dates? And I guess that means in terms of how to staff and to replicate possibly the process that you have.
Our process right today is very manual in many ways. We do have the automated to-do items, but as far as reviewing the documentation, we have 1 or 2 people review, depending on how often the stuff comes in, review the documents to see if it looks like they're authentic documents, and they've really become very good at this. But as far as for traditional schools, you're going to be probably since you start one time in the semester, or typically start one big start, you would be bombarded with a lot of documentation. So I would say that to having 4 staffers if you have them available, but you could probably get away with 2.
All right.
Depending on how well they're trained and how dedicated they are to making sure they get that job done.
So we're going to transition. There's a few more questions, but I think Joe's going to have a chance to answer those in his presentation. So we'll transition to the next part where we look specifically at some of the prevention steps that have been taken. So Joe, we'll transition back to you.
Thanks again, Luke. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. If not, please let me know in the chat box. I've got there's so many good questions in the chat box, it's hard for me to pay attention to the presentation because I'd like to answer those. So I look forward to, whether it be in the question session afterwards or after this presentation altogether, I look forward to talking to people in more detail and answering some of these questions. There's just too much to answer right at this time. But anyways, this is fun stuff. The Student Financial Aid Fraud Management Process at University of Phoenix, this slide kind of represents that. When you see the acronym AEC, that stands for Apollo Ethics and Compliance, we're notified of potential fraud, via a campus or one of our internal reports. That's how it starts out. At that point, we have a group that reviews, determines if it meets the established fraud scheme criteria. Keisha talked about this earlier, but we obviously have to be very careful that we're not impacting good students, and slowing them down in the process or negatively impacting them in any way. So we have a very specific and stringent criteria that before we start sending somebody through a different process or slowing them up or whatever, and that's for a multitude of good reasons, of course. It could be very possible that there could be 2 people living at the same address, attending at the same time, but when it gets more than that, when you have 4 people, 5 people or something at one address attending school at the same time, it gets a little bit unreasonable, and we have specific criteria that we've set up that we believe is reasonable, where we then feel if it meets those numbers or that criteria, then we can run them through the process. So the next dot is the students are, if we do believe that they're potentially fraud, the students are transferred to a specialized employee fraud team and their files are placed on hold. I'll talk about that specialized employee fraud team in a minute. It also has to do with something Keisha talked about earlier about employee morale and about our staff having to deal with these fraudsters who are typically very abusive and obviously have no intent of really attending school. The students we put them through what we call an INTREV process, or an internal review process. They have 30 days to complete that process by submitting identity documents that we've asked for in that process. We do so by a letter, and then if they do submit the documents within the 30 days, then we review those documents, and if it's good, we'll reverse them, if you will, and allow them to continue through the process. Or if there's problems, we won't, and we'll stop them. Typically, the students just go away. They don't even, I'd say the bulk of them don't even return the documents. I think they realize at that point that they've been caught and they don't want to submit the stuff. And for those that do, oftentimes the documents they submit are altered or doctored, and then we're able to determine that. And of course, we shut them down, and we also use those altered and send those along to the OIG as additional information and fodder for them to use in their investigations, because now they started to forge documents, sometimes government IDs and passports and a number of different things. So that's certainly helpful and information that the OIG likes once they take those additional steps at trying to do the fraud. And then the last one, if the group does not meet the reversal criteria, we then ultimately refer them to the OIG. Going on to the next slide. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Talked about this a little bit as well. For different institutions, they're going to have a different way of going about this. Many times the institution is small and there's one person that's already wearing 15 other hats, and they get handed another hat, which is now to combat the fraud problem. And so obviously the efforts that some institutions are able to put, resources they're able to put towards this are going to vary. Also, some schools are just smaller. We're a large school. We have a large student population, and we have, because of our footprint and the amount of attacks that we get when it comes to this, we were kind of forced to put a fairly large effort forth to combat. So our Apollo Ethics and Compliance team, the members of our team, we call them the Fraud Squad, but the ones that deal with this specifically is really 4 full-time employees dedicated to this anti-fraud effort. I think that's actually now probably 3. We've been able to get better over time with data, as Keisha talked about, and really letting the data do a lot more of the work than the actual people do. Really, there's 2 people. There's 1 full-time person that does this. There's 2 counselors that I'll talk about, and there's a manager that handles this, and they're the ones that are working on this. We also have a university orientation course where it's a 3-week, no-cost, non-credit course required for all new students with less than 24 college credits. This is an opportunity for those new students coming into the university to kind of test drive it and see if the University of Phoenix is the right school for them. There's no cost. There's no financial aid at that point. This was not an initiative that was created by my team or us, this university initiative, but it was created during the time that we started to see these fraud students, a couple years after we were battling this, and that helped because once this is in there, that gives us a buffer. Typically, the students that are committing these schemes don't have 24 college credits, and so that gave us an additional 3 weeks to compile data before they even started getting any sort of student financial aid, and it also put up an additional barrier for them and additional time for them to get the money. Their job is to get in and get it out, and so putting this additional 3 weeks in there is helpful. It certainly didn't stop it. I think it slowed it down, but that was kind of an ancillary benefit of this particular university initiative that helped us out. We also have a student SFA suspected fraud scheme intake form that we created on our intranet, I guess you call it, so that employees are, of course, our first line of defense. We can track data and massage data and look for these schemes all day long, but our frontline ones that are talking to these students, they're the ones that are going to recognize suspicious behavior, things that don't match, things that don't sound right, people coaching in the background, or gender mismatches, or things that don't sound right. So we want our employees, we certainly don't want our employees accusing these people of committing fraud, but we do know that they're going to be the ones have an awareness of something fishy, and so we want them to get those students over to us so that we can then give a better look. So we've created an internal form which works well for us because we are so spread out and we do have a lot of employees on the front end. We wanted to have a consistent, effective way for them to get both fraud students, suspicious students over to us so we can do that review, and they're not doing any sort of review, and they're basically can go in their time with students that really do want to pursue their education. We also have of course, in order to do that, we have to have an employee education awareness campaign launched, to let these employees know what's going on and what these schemes are and what they aren't, so that they're not, referring the wrong students to us. And so that's kind of an ongoing thing that we do because there is, of course, employee turnover, and we want to make sure there's regular, semi-regular communication going out so that they're aware of this. This next slide talks about prevention techniques and some of the IT initiatives. I'm not going to go into the details of all these different reports, but really the bulk of our program is all report and data driven. In order to do that, we had to develop early on a data mart that would house all the information from all our different internal systems and put them into one data mart so that we could then leverage that data mart and go in and pull reports that would help us look for students' potentially suspicious activity. We found this is really, like I said, the key to our operation. This is the main part of it. And these different reports, the duplicate demographic report, basically demographics, the direct deposit report, is kind of self-explanatory. Students leaders will use the same direct deposit checking account number or savings number or whatever. If we have a number of students' funds going into one number, then that could be legitimate, but most likely something else going on there. So there's all kinds of different reports that we use. This is not even an all-inclusive list, but these are some of the main ones. I'm happy to talk more about these offline with anybody, set up time where we could really go into detail on this with anyone who is interested in learning about how these reports work and how we run them and what the criteria is and things like that. But of course, in this particular format, we don't have time to do this. I'll go through quickly. This is some real fraudster data examples, if you will. Some of the other ways that we catch or we identify students that are potentially doing fraud. If you look at information, you'll see that they're using similar login IDs. So when they're logging into the online environment, they create an ID, and oftentimes those login IDs will have a number code at the end. And so you'll see that this picture doesn't really show what I'm actually talking about. I'll use different codes and things that we can track because they're similar. They're also logged into oftentimes taking the same program. They'll have same phone number, the same address, as you can see there to the right. Their emails will also, email addresses will oftentimes follow similar patterns, as will their login IDs. They'll use kind of coding, so they'll have Joe123 and Fred123 and Bill123, and you can look for all the different first names with 123 at the end, and anyways, you can oftentimes, we have here Money God, Golden, different Jeremy Cash Register, Big Hustle Brady. They'll also get kind of funny with some of the, not that necessarily is indicative of fraud, but we do oftentimes see that with some of these people. They're pretty brazen with what they do. Moving on to the next one, the fraud student management process. As Keisha talked about earlier, there is an issue. We feel very similarly that there's a real impact on our counselors who, as you can imagine, and as you probably have, their job is to work with students to help them change their lives and pursue their goals through education and build rapport. And these are pretty much good conversations that they're having with students in their futures. And these fraud students when they come in, they're very abusive. They're using profanity and very abusive and just downright mean and demoralizing. And so we want, as much as we can, get this population of students away from our good enrollment counselors who are trying to do their jobs and work with good students and help them. And we funnel those students to a select group, those 2 lucky people who get to deal with those students all day long. They actually enjoy doing it, and they're good at it, and they're well trained. And so we basically code those students and put them into that special fraud team, if you will, or that team to handle those students, just so they're having to deal with that, and it's not spread out to our other enrollment and counselor staff. I talked about earlier how we self-select them for additional verification. That's the INTREV process, where we have them filling out extensive identification documents. This is designed to stop the bad actors, and of course it permits the good actors to proceed, because all the information we're asking for is stuff that they should be able to readily provide. It certainly does cause some delay, but it's all information that any legitimate student should have. The final bullet here is oftentimes there are students that we still believe are fraud, but they don't necessarily meet our internal criteria, so we have to kind of allow them to proceed based on our own criteria. But what we do is put them on a watch list, an internal watch list that we do regularly, the people on our fraud team, and see if any new students have jumped into the scheme, if there's any new demographic or any sort of information that would now allow us to be able to stop from proceeding. So the watch list is an important part because we are pretty good at identifying these fraud students. Over the years, our success is about 99% as far as the students that we've actually had to reverse, meaning the students that we flagged inappropriately that really did legitimate, that somehow got caught in our web. It's only 1%. So we feel that it's not so great for that 1%, but overall we feel that's an acceptable percentage. The referrals to the OIG, it couldn't be more important. This particular slide just how we refer the stuff to them and how we get it to them. So primarily the information is burned on a DVD and shipped to them. There's different ways you can do it. Obviously email can be problematic due to all the PII and the different sorts of information, and so we will either ship them a DVD or sometimes we'll do an email. Different OIG agents may want it different ways, but and then these bullet points below give some of the documents and an example of some of the things we give them to them. So we're not just saying, here's these 10 students, we believe that they're doing something suspicious. We're providing them a ton of extra information, all the different reasons why, and showing them the forged documents, the Facebook, whatever it is that we've discovered that we believe they're linked, giving that to them so that we can kind of spoon feed that to them so that they're not having to do extra work. So this is just an example of something. We're basically a packet, not just a few names, and we're giving them basically a referral packet, which includes a bunch of information. This is just examples of fraudulent documents that we I was talking to somebody in the chat about different documents. Some of them are very good frauds, most of them are very bad. There's misspellings, there's cut and paste, there's things that are crooked. So oftentimes it's very obvious and sometimes even quite comical, the stuff that they will submit to try and fool us. But it's interesting regarding just an example of that. Same thing here. If you look on the Social Security card, I don't know if you can see it, but there's obvious cut and paste where they cut numbers out and then paste it onto the Social Security card to make it look the same. Same thing here with some of these other, their water bill and different things that we ask them to prove residence. So it's important to do a manual review. You know, it's important to collect the documents, but then of course to carefully review the documents that were received because oftentimes they are fictitious and fraudulent. The next slide here, I'm running out of time, but one of the best ways to measure our success is through what we call a catch rate. And so by catch rate, I mean out of all the students that we flagged that we believe are fraudulent or suspicious, how many of those are getting away and getting out the door with money? Basically, our catch rate is 80%, meaning that out of the 100 students, every 100 students that come and attack us in this way, only 20% of them are getting away with any sort of money. We would certainly like to 20%, and we've had months where our catch rate has gone as high as 85%, but the average is closer to 75 or 80. We've had months where it's been lower, but we average right around 80%, and we're pretty proud of that. I don't know that 100% is really possible due to the way that we're set up and the way that we catch a lot of these students is through demographical matches and things like that. So we have to have a number of before we even kind of catch on. But we're always looking for ways to increase that catch rate, and I think it's important to do that for anybody involved in the process because that way they can show the powers that be at their institution, you know, how good or not they're doing, how good their fraud program is, if you will, and if your catch rate is only 50% and ours is 80, then there's certainly room for improvement there, and it may be, you know, you would want to seek out information from other schools to see what they're doing to get that better catch rate. So we believe that's important. This other slide I'll just get through real quick. Back to the OIG and really any law enforcement, it's important to have a successful, an important and good relationship, a healthy relationship, I should say, with the law enforcement. I've heard from the OIG themselves that a lot of schools are afraid, to give them referrals and to talk to them or whatever. They seem to think it looks bad for the institution if they've been involved in fraud. The OIG that I've talked to, they never think of it that way. They understand that all schools have some sort of fraud. It doesn't reflect poorly on the school. They want that communication to be often and as much as possible, and they hope for that. And more schools are coming around and doing that, but there's still a lot of schools out there, I'd say the bulk of them, who don't. So it's important to have a good relationship with the OIG, and that way you can get them the information that they best need, and hopefully they'll get the referrals that you're sending over work. The more you learn what they want and what they're going to need, the better you get at making these referrals and giving them the information, and the smoother it will be for everybody involved. Chance of success they will have for successfully investigating and then getting this over to a prosecutor who will be able to successfully prosecute. This last, I don't know if this is the last, yeah, I think it is the last slide. It says School Coalition. This is just an example. This isn't an all-inclusive list either, but this is an example of some of the schools that we with over the past several years. These schools have actually came to University of Phoenix, to our Apollo group, or to our corporate offices and trained with us. We've opened our doors and opened our books, if you will, when it comes to our program, and spent, sometimes hours, other times a couple of days to train and to share best practices with these different schools, because we, again, strongly believe, that the best way to combat these fraudsters is through sharing of information and best practices. Individually, we could do a great job, and I think we do a great job at University of Phoenix identifying and stopping and referring these students, and I know a lot of other schools do a great job too. Rio Salado, of course, is one of them, but if we don't work together, these students are just going to jump from one school to the other. We know they do that, and they're going to continue to do that. So unless we're all on board and working together and sharing best practices with each other, I think that's, it's really not going to all issues. So this is just an example of some of the schools that have been directly involved with us and, like I said, traveled or visited our offices, and that we've traded information and shared everything with, and I think to much success and to much detriment of the fraudsters. So that's it for me. I guess back to Luke.
Thanks, Joe. And for our participants that remain on the call, Megan has been compiling all the questions, and what we're going to ask of our presenters is that they provide a response to some or all of the questions, and we post that on the WCET website because I know that we're close to the end of our time. But we certainly received a great number of quality questions, and we'll work to respond and get that information disseminated back out to you. I'm going to turn it back over to Megan now. I want to thank you all for participating. She has a few items to cover with you before we finish our webcast, but I just want to encourage you to be on the lookout for responses to your questions very soon.
Thank you all, and I just quickly want to thank Luke, Ruby, Joe, and Keisha. Thank you for contributing to this wonderful presentation, such useful content. And we will download this presentation, have it posted on YouTube. I'll send you a link next week along with the slides, and I'll also send the questions that weren't answered to the presenters and provide written responses as soon as we can. So again, thank you to the wonderful presenters. I want to just mention a few events and programs that are coming up for WCET. If you're getting started with data analytics at your institution, consider joining us in beautiful Vail, Colorado next month for our Data Analytics Bootcamp. We have our annual meeting coming up in Portland, November 19th to the 21st, and we'll be sending out information about the call for proposals soon. And if you're not a member of WCET, do consider joining us. There's information on our website about all the benefits. Benefits extend to everybody at your institution. If you're a current member, we have very active listservs, so make sure you're part of those listserv discussions. Go ahead and contact us if you want to be added. And as mentioned, there will be an archive posted on our Webcast webpage, and there's also links to all of our previous webcasts. Again, thank you to Blackboard Collaborate for making the platform available. Thank you to WCET supporting members and our sponsors who really help underwrite our events and programs, and we greatly appreciate their contributions. So again, thank you all. Thanks to our presenters. Enjoy your afternoon.